It's time to give out grades for the 2025 NFL Draft. In the first round, the Jets get an A. After that, it wasn't terrible, but there are some areas for improvement. Let's break down the Jets 2025 Draft today on Locked On Jets.
You are Locked On Jets, your daily New York Jets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome. This is the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. It is Monday, April 28th, 2025, and I'm your host, John B. from GanggreenNation.com. Thanking you so much for making the show your first listen or first watch every day. A big shout out to you everydayers. This is a daily podcast covering the New York Jets with new episodes each day through the week, Monday through Friday. And today's episode is brought to you by the all-new 2025 Nissan Armada. Stay tuned for the Armada Draft Pick of the Week later in the show. Well, today we're giving out grades for the 2025 NFL Draft. Thursday through Saturday, the Jets selected 4 new players. Hopefully will be part of the core of the team going forward. There are a couple different categories I'd like to grade the Jets on. And I'd like to start off with the best part of the draft, and that was the first round. And we know your first round pick's your most important pick because that's your best opportunity to get a high talent player. And I think the Jets did very well in picking Armand Membou out of Missouri, 7th overall. The way the board fell, I felt like it was kind of obvious that's the direction the Jets were going to go in. And when you get on the clock, there are lots of different factors that come into play. I mean, people make it out to be best player available versus need, but there are so many other factors. I mean, you think about how important positions are. You think about building areas of strength for your roster over the long run. There are other things that come into play. You can think about the strength of a draft. Which positions are strong in a draft? If I don't get this position in the first round, I may not be able to get a quality player here later on. And I think all of these things added up to making Membou the logical pick. I think Ted McMillan maybe could have been in play, but Jets needed the right tackle. This Jets offense was going to have a tough time functioning this season without a right tackle. And if the season began heading in with the way things looked heading into Thursday night, the Jets would have been looking at starting Chukwuma Okorafor at right tackle. And that's a guy who we've talked about on the show who has been benched in each of the last 2 seasons. So that's not really a guy you could trust moving forward. With Membou in at right tackle, the final piece of the offensive line has been solved. Jets began this offseason probably feeling pretty good at 4 of the 5 offensive line spots. Olu is not a 100% lock to be a quality left tackle, but I think you had to really like the way he ended his rookie season. And I think the odds are very good that he's going to be a quality player going forward. Up the middle, you've got the trio of John Simpson, Joe Tippmann, Elijah Vera Tucker. 3 of them played well last year. 3 of them have chemistry. We're playing next to each other for a year. And Vera Tucker finally found a home at right guard after bouncing around the line. He's, his first 3 years, he played 4 of the 5 spots on the offensive line. The only spot he did not play at one point was center and got injured a bunch, maybe because he was moving around. Finally found a home at right guard. Right tackle was really the question mark. So the Jets filled an immediate need by signing Membou. And, with the skill group looking the way it looks right now, Jets are really going to need to lean into their offensive line this year. This is an offensive line that's going to need to play at a high level for the Jets offense to have success because you've got a good receiver in Garrett Wilson. You've got a good back in Breece Hall. You've got a maybe in Justin Fields at quarterback. But I think it's fair to say the skill positions have some question marks at them in 2025, which means the offensive line is going to have to be able to win one-on-ones. They're going to have to be able to pass protect, and they're going to need to be able to move people in the run game. And Membou is a high-end prospect in this area. But it goes beyond immediate need. It goes to other aspects like building strengths. Now, on both ends of the line, you have a young tackle. You've got a second-year left tackle in Olu Fashanu. You've got a first-year right tackle in Armand Membou. And if things go well, you're not going to have to worry about the tackle position for the next 8 years or so. If things go well, of course, no prospects a lock. But you got real potential here to not have to worry about the tackle position for a very long time. And it's not just about filling immediate needs. It's also about creating strengths. Tackle's a critical position. Tackle's a position you want to be a strength. And it has the potential to be a big strength now for the Jets because they've invested back-to-back first-round picks at the tackle spot. And Now the Jets have two guys who are going to be cost controlled for the next couple of years at the tackle spot. Tackles are expensive to pay. It's not easy. First of all, there aren't a lot of good tackles who hit free agency, but tackles also get expensive the longer they're in the league. For the next 2 years, next 3 years, Olu Fashanu and Armand Membou are going to be cost-controlled players. One of the things we always talk about on this show and in this league in general is the advantage of having the quarterback on the rookie contract, because quarterbacks are expensive. You have a quarterback on a rookie contract, you get quality play, but you save a lot of money. And the money you're not paying the quarterback can go to build up the rest of your team. It may not be true to the same extent at tackle, but it is true there. If you have two good young tackles who are on rookie contracts, you're saving a lot of money. Usually to have good tackles, you have to pay a lot. So you're getting the good tackles at a discount, and the rest of that money can go towards building up the rest of the roster. This is the type of team building I think you can get behind. And if Membou and Fashanu pan out, the Jets are going to be able to neutralize the other team's top edge rushers. One of the challenges in this league, if you only have one good tackle, edge rushers in this day and age move around. They'll find the weakness. If your weak tackle's on the left side, he'll go line up against him. If your weak tackle's on the right side, the top edge rusher will go line up against him. You can move an edge rusher around and find the weakness. If neither tackle spot is weak, then you've really got something. And it gives you an advantage because you're not going to have to provide that tackle extra help. You're not going to have to leave the tight end into chip. You're not going to have to leave the back end to chip. You can send all 5 of your receivers into patterns. It puts more stress on the back of a defense. There are just certain spots where it makes sense to invest. And offensive line is one of those spots because at the end of the day, we go crazy about the wide receivers who make plays, and rightly so. Wide receivers are important. We go crazy about the quarterbacks, of course. Quarterback's most important position on the field. We go crazy about the guys that get sacks. We go crazy about the guys that get interceptions. But football is a game where if you can control the trenches on the offensive line, it's a big deal. It's the type of thing that can move your team forward. So there was a lot to like about this pick. And also, he's also a really good prospect. There's a reason Armand Membou went 7th overall. He's a kid who went out and played at a really high level in the SEC at a young age. And there's still a lot of room to grow. Only 20 years old. So, when you draft a guy and he's 20 years old, he's already played at a high level. There's a lot of runway there. There's still a lot of time. He's still really far away from his physical peak. He's far away from his prime. And you'd think that there's going to be a lot of growth potential there. He's going to be able to develop and become even better, as he ages and gets into his mid-20s. Because a lot of players, that's when they hit their prime in their mid-20s. Armand Membou is still far away from there. He was already playing at a really high level in the SEC. Now, of course, like any offensive lineman you draft these days, there are very few that are pro ready. Armand Membou is going to have to do some developing. I think there are moments where his technique, is not where it needs to be. But I don't think anybody was looking at that pick at 7 overall and saying Jets made a big reach there. I think everybody thought Armand Membou was a tackle who was very worthy of a top 10 pick. So if we're giving a grade for how the Jets handled the first round, I give him an A because you could have drafted the tight ends, Tyler Warren. I think that would have been a mistake. You could have gone to Ted McMillan, would have been a little bit more sense, made more sense, but you're leaving a big hole at the right tackle position. And the Jets now have an offensive line that at least has the potential to be quite good. And not only could it be good, it's young. You have 4 of your 5 offensive linemen, you're 5 or younger. So it's not an offensive line. It's an offensive line that you could keep together for a long time. And it could be, this group could grow together for a long time. I think that, most people are giving the Jets a high grade. I give them an A for the way they handled the first round. Now, here on the Locked On Jets podcast, I'm not going to say the rest of the draft was bad. I think you have to give guys a chance. I think the Jets drafted a number of players who have potential. But there were a few ways the Jets operated where I felt like maybe there could be improvement for the future. And it goes back to them kind of changing the way they operated from the first round. I'll explain what I mean by that as we continue here on this Monday edition of the Locked On Jets podcast. Today's episode of Locked On Jets is brought to you by Game Time. There's nothing like the atmosphere of an NBA playoff game. Every bucket, every defensive stop, every moment feels huge. It's electric in the arena, and with Game Time, you can be part of it without the stress of last-minute ticket hunting. Game Time makes it fast and easy to get playoff tickets, even when demand is sky high. Prices on the app actually go down the closer it gets to tip-off, and their last-minute deals can save you up to 60%. I've used Game Time not just for NBA tickets. I've used it for football. I've used it for tickets to the theater. It's an amazing place to get last minute deals. They give you all in pricing, so no surprise fees when you check out. They'll also give you the view from your seat. They give you a picture of what it's going to look like from your seat, so no surprises. You know exactly what you're going to see when you arrive at your venue. Take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem code LOCKEDONNFL, LOCKEDONNFL, one word with no space, for $20 off. Download Game Time today. Last minute tickets, lowest price, guaranteed. Thank you so much for making Locked On Jets your first listener, first watch every day. And a big shout out to you everydayers. This is a daily podcast covering the New York Jets. We have new episodes each day through the week, Monday through Friday. Today we're giving out grades for the Jets in the 2025 NFL draft. And we began by giving the Jets an A for the way they handled the first round, picking Armand Membou out of Missouri, a pick that I think made so much sense on so many different levels. We're going to move on now, and I'm not going to grade it pick by pick. I'm going to now move to the bigger picture. Because I think there are a couple different ways you look at an NFL draft class. One of them is, does each pick have the potential to justify the selection that was made? You know, does the second round pick the Jets made, Mason Taylor, is there a realistic chance that he could justify the Jets drafting him in the second round? Absolutely. I think every player the Jets drafted could justify their selection. But there's more than like whether the individual player justifies his specific selection. There's also the question of like overall strategy, not just there's the question of each individual pick. There's also a question of, do these picks collectively make sense? Are these picks the way you build a good team? I think that this was an area where I might give the Jets a grade of needs improvement. I think that there were a couple of things that I did not love about this draft class. And it wasn't really that I disliked any of the draft picks per se. It's just more of a big picture thing. I'm a big believer that you can't you can't like look at a specific pick, like our second round pick, and say we need to draft a player at X position right there. Right? I don't think like you can look at your third round pick and say, all right, we're going to draft a wide receiver in the third round no matter what. I think that's a bad idea. But you can lean towards certain positions. I think in this league, when you are drafting, there are certain positions that you kind of have to prioritize over others. And if all things are equal, you lean towards that position. And at some point in the draft, you may not be able to pinpoint exactly where you're going to pick a player at a certain position. At a certain point in the draft, you want to make sure there are certain positions you draft. And I think that this is an area where Jets lost me a little bit. I think the first round pick, there was that was what I call a meat and potatoes pick. That's a pick where you're trying to win in the trenches. I think after that, there was a lack of meat and potatoes from the Jets on both sides of the ball. Generally speaking, this was not viewed as a very deep draft class. This was viewed as a pretty weak class overall. One of the few positions that was viewed as a strength, though, was the defensive tackle spot. And that's a spot where the Jets could really use an investment, because the only good defensive tackle on this team right now is Quinnen Williams. And that's a guy who was drafted 6 years ago. So there's not really any young defensive tackle talent on this team right now. And in a year where a position group's deep, that doesn't necessarily, you don't necessarily need to draft a tackle. Mason Graham was gone, so that wasn't an option in the first round. I'm not saying the Jets needed to draft a defensive tackle in the second round, but in a year where the defensive tackle crop was strong, it would have made sense, even if it was just a developmental guy. Draft somebody later on and try and develop him. And I think the Jets failed to lean into the strength of this draft class. I think I'm not going to criticize any of the individual picks, but I will say at some point I think the Jets probably should have found a defensive tackle guy, because again, meat and potatoes. Every new coach and GM tells you they're going to build the team in the trenches. Aaron Glenn did that. The question is whether they do it or not. I think that like for Aaron Glenn's defense, corner is more important. Corner takes precedent. And that's one of the reasons I'm not upset about what they did in the third round, taking the corner out of Florida State. But I do think at some point they probably should have drafted the tackle because, in Robert Saleh's defensive line was the most important spot, but corner was still important. Corner may have been a little bit less important than defensive line, but it was still really important. In Aaron Glenn's defense, corner is a little bit more important than defensive line, but defensive line is still important. So I'm not saying they should have passed on a corner in the third round. I do think they probably should have looked at the defensive line. And beyond that, I'm a big believer in really focusing on the offensive line. And the Jets starting offensive line set right now. But I think this is a good spot. I think when your offensive line set, that's a good spot where even if it's day 3, find a project offensive line prospect you like. And it's an opportunity to groom him to become a quality backup. Maybe, a year from now, John Simpson's a free agent. If you can't hold on to John Simpson. Now, Jets could hold on to John Simpson because, they're not paying their tackles much. So they might be able to pay both Elijah Vera Tucker and John Simpson in the next couple of years because the money that's not going to tackles who are cheap, you might be able to spend on both guards. But if you need to let John Simpson walk in a year, this would be a good point to draft somebody this year, try and coach them up. These are just the little things. And the reason I'm giving them needs improvement is that it's just one draft. So it may just be a situation where, this year just didn't make sense for them. Sometimes you have grand ideas. Sometimes you believe in these things, but it's just not the right year. Things just did not line up for you. So it very well could be that. It very well could be the case with Aaron Glenn and Darren Muji that they wanted to do these things, but it's just the situation never arose. So that's why I'm going to give them a needs improvement grade. And the other thing I'd look at is the wide receiver position. It's a position where the Jets are weak. It's a position that's been kind of underinvested in the last couple of years. Early in Joe Douglas's tenure, Jets invested a lot at wide receiver. Second round picks in Denzel Mims and Elijah Moore. Obviously didn't work so well, but the investment was there. First round pick in Garrett Wilson. Well, since the Jets drafted Garrett Wilson, the only 2 receivers the Jets have drafted are Malachi Corley last year and Arian Smith in the 4th round this year. I think it's fair to say, both those guys, I don't know that you can really call either of them a true receiver per se, from the standpoint that I think the Jets drafted both of them to kind of be gadget guys. Maybe the Jets want to develop them into quality players, but I think, in many ways, Corley was kind of like a gadget guy, at least that was the plan early in his career. I think you could say the same thing for Arian Smith, a guy with a lot of speed, but a guy whose game needs a lot of work. And the Jets not having much talent at the receiver position beyond Garrett Wilson, the Jets not having invested the last couple of years at the wide receiver position, I think it was a little disappointing to leave this draft and the only wide receiver you took was Arian Smith, a guy who, first of all, in the 4th round, I think was probably drafted a little bit too high relative to his profile, relative to his ability, relative to how likely he is to succeed, but also relative to the reality that he's probably, at best a gadget player. So again, needs improvement. Look, you have to judge each draft class on its merits. There can be improvement down the line. It may have just been the situation where Jets felt like it didn't line up this year, but our philosophy going forward is we're going to invest at wide receiver. So I'm not going to give them a negative grade, but I'm going to say this is something I'm going to look for in the years ahead with Aaron Glenn and Darren Muji, because these are things that I think the Jets are going to need to focus on. And these were things that I left the draft feeling a little bit uneasy about. And during the Locked On Jets podcast, there's one last philosophy that I feel like I did not love. And to be honest with you, this is nothing that's set in stone. It's more of a read of mine. It's an educated guess on how the Jets operated. But it's something that I do see some circumstantial evidence for. What needs to improve, I'll tell you as we continue here on this Monday edition of Locked On Jets. The Armada Pick of the Week is brought to you by our friends at Nissan and the all-new 2025 Nissan Armada. This week, we're highlighting the top pick from our draft, the one selection that truly stood out, the guy who showcased the strength and power to push the Jets forward as we look ahead to the next season. And this week's Armada and clear-cut top pick of the draft is, of course, Armand Membou. Jets drafted him because he will help them on the offensive line for years to come. He has a heavy-duty skill set. He's rugged. He, just like Nissan conquers the road with capability and confidence, Armand Membou will conquer the football field. And when it comes to the Nissan Armada, they say go forth and conquer. And that's exactly what I think Armand Membou will do here. It's clear that our top pick of the draft is ready to conquer the road ahead with confidence, just like you can in the all-new Nissan Armada or any of their other outstanding vehicles. Take the Nissan Armada, Rogue, or Pathfinder and go find your next big adventure. Shop NissanUSA.com. Shop NissanUSA.com. And this is the Locked On Jets podcast here on this Monday. We're talking about Jets draft grades for 2025. There are 7 new members of the New York Jets, 7 players the Jets drafted over the weekend. How do we grade the selections? In the first segment, I gave the Jets an A for how they handled the first round, picking Armand Membou out of Missouri. In the second segment, I gave the Jets a neat improvement for one aspect of the way they handled the draft, and that was kind of ignoring critical positions. I'm going to give them a third needs improve. I'm going to give them a second needs improvement here in the third segment. And this is one where I'm kind of like just reading the way the Jets handled things. There was an aspect of the way they ran the draft I did not love, and I just got the feeling, like watching them operate, that they were kind of like looking at each pick and saying, I want to fill this specific role with this pick. In the second round, I want to get a starting tight end. In the third round, I want to get a developmental corner. In the fourth round, we want to get like kind of a fast guy. We can run gadget plays at the wide receiver. And that's the fourth round was kind of like what sold me on this. Mason Taylor's a pretty decent prospect in the second round. Thomas is a good developmental corner in round 3. But like by round 4, when you're picking Arian Smith, a guy who was on nobody's radar, a guy his skill set doesn't justify a 4th round pick. His resume, his stat line doesn't justify a 4th round pick. His grasp of the fundamentals doesn't justify a 4th round pick. After that selection, news came out that the Jets had a role in mind for him. And that's what kind of like convinced me that the Jets just kind of viewed these picks as they wanted to fill a specific role with each pick. And if you look at what they did in the rest of day 3, they essentially got a lot of guys who really don't have high odds of being starters, guys who maybe are, overage prospects, guys who aren't, guys who don't really have great athletic tools. It kind of felt like they were just looking to draft backups. And look, I think if you get a backup on day 3 of the draft, that's not a bad thing. But I think like you should kind of like mix in like the high floor, low ceiling guys who are going to be backups with a few guys who could potentially develop into starters. I always think it's good to have like a mix of prospect types. But I think this all speaks to like something that the good teams do. The good teams don't go into the draft with a preconceived notion that what they're going to do with a specific pick. Yes, like they focus on certain positions over others, as I mentioned. The good teams will focus on making sure there's always a steady stream of linemen coming in, offensive linemen, defensive tackles. They will focus on making sure they have enough quality skill players. They always try and replenish the well at these positions before there's a crisis. But they also let the draft board come to that. And what does that mean? They're not always going to pick a player at a spot that they need. They're not always going to look to fill a specific role. If a great player falls to them, they'll just take the great player. If a great player gets within 2 or 3 picks of them, then they'll trade up for that player. It may not be in the position they're in dire need of right now. These are teams like the Philadelphia Eagles, the Baltimore Ravens, teams at the top of the league, teams that are always in the contending mix, teams that always draft well. I think you get yourself into trouble if you get too much tunnel vision. And look, this is Aaron Glenn and Darren Muji's first draft. Maybe this was just something they wanted to get a few guys in here for year 1. Maybe there were certain roles they felt they needed to fill for year 1. This is possible. But again, that's why I'm not going to give them a bad grade. It's going to be a grade of needs improvement. It's going to be a grade. This is going to be something that I want them to change going forward because, and especially like the area, I don't want to be too critical of Arian Smith because look, he's going to come here. I'm going to root for him. I'm going to hope he is a better pro player than he was than a college player. But this is not a guy like you should be obsessed with getting in the 4th round. I don't know what everybody else's draft board is. I mean, there may have been another team that rated him really high, but to me, this is a guy like if you want to take him in the 7th round, that makes sense because he's got a ton of speed. He's got one outlier attribute physically, and he's a good special teamer. But taking him in the 4th round, I don't love that concept of taking him in the 4th round just because just because there's a specific role, a gadget role you want to put him in. I think that's not good business practice for an NFL team. I mean, that's a guy I'm willing to let fall to the 7th round. And you may say, well, another team may have graded him really high. Well, part of letting the draft board come to you means that you're not going to reach for a player just because you want to fill a specific role. If another team picks him, then you know what, there are other prospects out there. You can't force these things. And I worry that maybe the Jets forced a couple things in the NFL draft because there were certain spots they wanted to make sure that they filled. And perhaps they let better opportunities go past them. Don't want to be overly critical. First year head coach, first year GM. Just as I don't want to praise them too much when they do something I agree with. We'll learn a lot more about Aaron Glenn and Darren Muji once the games actually start. We don't know how good of a coach Glenn is. We don't know how good of a GM Muji is. The proof is in the results on the field. But these are areas, just watching this, I was a little uneasy seeing the way things were unfolding over the last two days of the NFL draft, particularly on day 3, because I think the Jets missed some opportunities. And I think the reason they missed some opportunities is they maybe I saw some signs of a little bit of tunnel vision, and that's not, that's the type of thing you got to look to avoid, because the teams that draft really well, are like kind of open to the flows of the draft. They're open to something unexpected happening and maybe taking a player that wasn't on their radar if the player is good enough and if it presents enough of an opportunity for you. Anyway, that's all for today's episode. This has been the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day is our motto. As always, if you enjoy the show, hit the subscribe button where you're watching or listening so that you'll never miss an episode. If you enjoy the show and are listening on a podcast source, give it a 5-star review. And if you're watching on YouTube and enjoy the show, give this episode a big thumbs up. Helps us out, helps other Jets fans find the podcast. Enjoy your Monday, everybody. We'll be back tomorrow to talk more Jets.